and welcome to part one of my WCW Monday Nitro Retrospective, where I take a look back at what I consider to be the best years of Monday Nitro, from its beginning on September 4th, 1995, to the Finger Poke of Doom, the first episode of 1999. Everything that happened in between of that encompasses the rise and ultimate successes of Monday Nitro and WCW as a brand, where you got the greatest heights of that company's history, again, in my opinion. Personally speaking, I would say that the best years for Nitro were probably 96, 97, and a little bit into 98. But today, we are going to be covering the early days of Monday Nitro. This is pre-NWO, so the period I'm covering here will be from the first episode in September 95 all the way to May 20th, 1996, the week before Scott Hall showed up. The week before the first 2-hour Nitro, where Nitro really started to take shape into what it ultimately became. In the good years, not the bad years in 99 and 2000 and all of that stuff when the company was on its last legs. But yeah, it was very interesting going back and doing this. And ever since I signed up for the WWE Network, one of the things I've wanted to do is go back and watch Monday Nitro. At least the good stuff. Yeah, again, it gets to a point. I felt like the Finger Poke of Doom was a good cutoff point, but you get to a point where it's like, yeah, I'm good, but I really want to relive all like the rise of the NWO and the build up to Hogan and Sting and the best years of the Cruiserweight Division and Chris Jericho coming into his own and you know, guys like Eddie Guerrero and Dean Malenko having some of the best matches in WCW history. Rey Mysterio becoming a national superstar in WCW. And various other things like that. And that was all the stuff that I really, really wanted to relive with these Nitro reviews. And the way I'm going to be doing this, like I said, I'm just going to be talking about the things that really stood out to me during the period of time that I'm covering. And like I said, in my last video, this is going to wind up being a 6-part series, I think, with the next part of this going to be covering the remainder of 1996, specifically the early days of the NWO. And then 97 is going to be split up into 2 parts, and then 98 and the Finger Poke of Doom, that's going to be split into 2 parts. So I think we're looking at what I'm shooting for is a 6-part series here. And it getting done is going to be reliant on how fast I can get through WCW Monday Nitro on the network. I mean, they are pretty long episodes. It's almost like watching a movie. You know, each episode is like a movie, so it's, you know, you can't just kind of whiz by all of it. As of this recording, I am through 1996. I have not started 1997 yet, so that gives you an idea of where I am. So I can probably give you part 2, like, next week, but then, you know, then you'll have to wait a while before I can get a good handle on the first part of 1997. So, with that said, the early period of Monday Nitro is a very interesting one, because it is one of growth. And you know, when you think of like WCW at its worst before the NWO showed up, the thing you really think of is the Dungeon of Doom. And the Dungeon of Doom and the feud with Hulk Hogan was the big major storyline going on at the time. Not an ideal storyline to have as your main focus when you're going on Monday nights up against the WWF and their flagship Monday night show, and kicking off the Monday Night Wars. So creatively, WCW not in a great place at this point. You know, there was kind of like this feeling, even though they got guys like Bobby Heenan and Mean Gene Okerlund, who were great, and I love them to death, there was this feeling like WCW at the time was kind of had a foot in the 1980s and just needed to get that foot out of the 80s and step on forward into the next generation, which they ultimately did with the NWO. And utilize those components, Mean Gene Okerlund, Bobby Heenan, Hulk Hogan, and all those things to great effect. And the greatest creative and financial successful highs that company ever had. It was just a matter of creatively catching up to the times, which, like I said, they ultimately did. But at this point, not entirely there yet. And these were also 1-hour Nitros. I think when most people think of Nitro, they think of the 3-hour shows, because it was like, I remember when they first went to 3 hours, and like, oh my god, what is this? Like, what are you doing? It's just too long. And now WWE does it all the time, and nobody bats an eyelash. It's crazy. But, I personally would be more in favor. Personally, I like a 1-hour show. I think, you know, it's quick, it's easy, it breezes by, and by the time you're done, you're craving more. And like, I think 1 hour is like ideal. But the Monday Night Wars period pretty much set the standard for a 2-hour show being like the goal that everybody seems to shoot for. I'm like, you watch Impact in its current state, does Impact really need to be 2 hours? Really? Does it really need to be 2 hours? You can shorten that to an hour and a half at least, I think, but especially since so much of it is just clip shows anyway. But so in this early growth period of Nitro, a lot of the things that we would come to associate with Nitro aren't quite in place yet. The Cruiserweight division is still in its formative stages. They're starting to get the talents. Like Eddie Guerrero was focused more than I remembered in those early episodes. He worked quite a few matches, and it was clear that they wanted to use him and make something out of him. And, quite famously, the first episode, which, by the way, the first episode I thought was really cool. And, some people say it's kind of lame that they held it in a fucking mall. But I liked it because it looked so radically different from everything else that you ever see on any other wrestling show. And whenever you do something like that and it just looks so amazingly different, it stands out to me. And it's like the images of that show stick out in my head. But I bring up the first episode mainly for the famous Flying Brian Pillman versus Jushin Thunder Liger match, the first match in Nitro history, which pretty much set the bar for WCW ultimately establishing its Cruiserweight division into what that ultimately became. And like I said, they had a few other talents around that were starting to show their skin, like an Eddie Guerrero and things like that. Dean Malenko and guys started showing up that would ultimately be huge cornerstones of the Cruiserweight division. And, the announce team, you had Eric Bischoff at the booth along with Bobby Heenan, who would be a mainstay. And Steve Mongo McMichael, who is terrible. Terrible. He's awful. He has his pet dog with him all the time, and he's making these really bad jokes at Heenan's expense. And it's just awful. It's just awful, terrible stuff. And fortunately, when they went to 2 hours, they would switch to this format, which I'll talk about in more detail when I do part 2, but they would switch to this format where they would switch announcers at the second hour. So the first hour you would get Tony Schiavone, and I think ultimately Schiavone would be recognized as the voice of WCW Monday Nitro. That was not the case in these early episodes. I don't recall seeing Schiavone at all, to be honest. He may have been like an interview segment or something like that, but he wasn't calling the show. And ultimately, I think the move to making Tony Schiavone like the lead guy, I think was pivotal for the announce team and giving WCW a voice. I like Tony. I'm a big Tony Schiavone fan, so got to give him some love. So the announce team wasn't quite there yet, but one thing that did strike me is that when they did the first episode in the mall and then they moved to like the regular set, they were pretty much, they hit it out of the park right away. The set looked awesome, and this is one thing. The WCW Monday Nitro set that they famously had with the announce desk close by the entranceway and the big kind of the metal kind of silvery look that they had, that is probably my favorite looking set for any wrestling show ever. Like any weekly wrestling show you can think of, whether it be Raw, SmackDown, Thunder, AEW Dynamite, TNA Impact, any of those. You think of any of those shows, I think Monday Nitro is probably my favorite looking set and show of any of them ever. I just love the look of that set. It just looks, it looks big time, but not so flashy that it's distracting. It's this right balance of just about everything. It looks epic without being overblown. And, I think WWE sometimes gets a little overblown with their production, especially now with the CGI graphics everywhere. I'm like, that looks so terrible. Why are you doing that? But anyway, so the set, they hit that right out of the park. And I think watching these early episodes, what really stood out to me, they weren't as bad as I remembered, because I think a lot of people look back on 1995 as a whole for WWE and WCW as being terrible. And I look back at these early episodes, I'm like, there's some good stuff there. It's not completely awful. A lot of things creatively needed to kind of sync up, but I think the overall live format and the overall approach that they were going with to try and get everything in place to prepare for the NWO. I think there was some really good stuff there. Some of the Ric Flair Randy Savage stuff was great with Miss Elizabeth turning heel, which shocked the hell out of me back then. It was like a list of people who I never expected to ever turn heel. Miss Elizabeth was very high on that list. So for her to turn heel and join up with Ric Flair, kind of like as a fulfillment to what was done back in 1992, heading into WrestleMania 8, that was shocking to me. So I think a lot of the stuff with Ric Flair was awesome watching these early episodes, by the way. He's sitting there, and it's like heavily implied that he's fucking both Elizabeth and Nancy Sullivan, woman. And he's just having a grand old time flirting with him and making out with him and all this other stuff. And Flair's promos are wild. And he has his own little VIP section for the Horsemen. And he's just so wildly entertaining in these episodes. It's just... And Ric Flair, more often than not, made like those early episodes of Nitro, even though Hulk Hogan was the champion and was the big star and everything. And I guess I'll take this time to talk about Hulk Hogan. And, I talked about how WCW felt like it had a foot in the 80s. It just needed to take that foot up and just step it on forward into the next decade. Hulk Hogan was definitely embodied that. Because everything that Hulk Hogan does during this period feels dated, and everything about it just feels old and stale. And, the classic Hogan material from the 80s and even into the early 90s, there's stuff that I love and appreciate, but when you start seeing him do it in 95, 96, it's like, it's a little lame at this point. You want to change it up, you want to do something a little different, and that was something that needed to change. And of course the Dungeon of Doom didn't help. A lot of the stuff with the Dungeon of Doom was cheesy and not great, even though some of it was super, super funny in how bad it was. Funny bad is not what you want to go for when you're presenting a cutting-edge wrestling promotion. And that was the Hulkamania versus the cartoony bad guys thing just wasn't working in 1995, and that was something they needed to kind of move away from. I will say this, like, much has been made about the WCW crowds turning on Hulk Hogan, and it did happen on some of those Nitros, especially in North Carolina. They hated him, and they just loved the Horsemen and Flair especially. But it wasn't as regular as I remembered it or as it's been talked about. It's kind of like, because I've heard people mention that, Shawn Michaels got booed all the time when he was the champion. And I look back on some of those shows, I'm like, Survivor Series 96 he did. They cheered Sid over him, and when he dropped the belt with the infamous, I Lost My Smile bit, they were spattering of boos there, but I don't remember it being like that regular of a thing that Shawn was getting booed out of the building. I think maybe it's something that happened a handful of times and it's just been overblown to make people think it happened every single show. There were some shows where Hogan was wildly over, and I guess it just depended on where they were. It was not like a John Cena thing, where it's like every fucking show was a mixed reaction. Every single goddamn show was a mixed reaction for like the prime of his career. That I didn't feel like the Hogan negativity was as strong as people made it out to be. But then again, I wasn't at the live events, so maybe the live events were different. And but on Nitro, it doesn't come across quite as much. In select areas, yes, like I said, North Carolina for sure. But even if the fans were cheering him, there's still this sense, like watching these shows, is like, yeah, they really needed to move away from this Mega Powers beat the bad guys thing, and that was a very apparent heading into Uncensored 96, where they had that stupid Doomsday Cage match, which I make fun of constantly as one of the dumbest matches I've ever seen. But Randy, I'll say this, Randy was great. Like, watching, it's like, some of Randy Savage's best material is in these early Nitros, because he just acts like a wild man. He legitimately feels like he's gone insane and he's going to murder people, especially when Liz turns on him. He just goes fucking nuts, and you think he's going to rip Flair's head off. And it's that side of Savage's personality that really shone through here. And I think, we all remember him for his work in WWF in the 80s, but I think Savage did some good stuff in WCW that gets overlooked. And I think some of those early Nitros are indicative of that. And you had Sting out there, of course, being a star. This is kind of like the last hurrah for Sting, is like that clear-cut babyface that we knew in the early 90s. An evolution was in the works for him as well, as we would see. We'll talk about that more in part 2 when we talk about the second half of 1996, when the Crow character comes about. But his big thing, he was teaming with Lex Luger, and there was this, Luger had joined the Dungeon of Doom, and they were like, can Luger be trusted with Sting, and yada, 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 all that stuff. And some of that got a little muddled and confusing. Ultimately, Luger turned out to be a good guy, and when they ran with Luger as a babyface, he got red fucking hot. But again, I'll talk about that more when I talk about part 2. But I thought, despite some of the confusing angles that they did there, Sting and Luger worked really well as a tag team. I think they might be WCW's version of the Mega Powers, dare I say. One of their better tag teams that gets overlooked. And speaking of tag teams, like, there's some matches here that I really appreciate. Of course, the Steiner brothers were on display, and I love the Steiner brothers. I'm a huge Steiner brothers mark. The Nasty Boys kind of had these wild brawling type of matches that were typically really fun to watch. Harlem Heat, they are so fucking cool. Like, going back and watching Harlem Heat, I'm like, these guys are awesome. Just bruiser badasses. Just fantastic. I loved watching them. And, you know, I've heard, I think it was Dave Meltzer who said that Stevie Ray doesn't deserve to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And my response to that, they didn't put Stevie Ray in as an individual. They put Harlem Heat in. And since the WWE Hall of Fame has transitioned into being a de facto, like, pro wrestling Hall of Fame that encompasses everything, even things that happened outside of the WWE, Harlem fucking Heat absolutely deserve to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. Nobody can change my mind on that. Sorry. Harlem Heat's great. I've really enjoyed watching them and go back and reliving some of that stuff. And so, yeah, there's stuff to enjoy there in those episodes, even with the Dungeon of Doom taking up a lot of time and unfortunately kind of dragging the show down and not giving WCW the direction they needed to take that next step. I guess the Dungeon of Doom at the time was a means to an end because they just wanted to have a villain factory for Hogan to mow down. And I've heard Sullivan describe it that way. But in these early episodes of Nitro, they're what really drags the show down. Except for the Giant, who is about as perfectly booked a big guy as you could ever ask in the last, like, 25, 30 years. The guy who would ultimately become the Big Show in WWE. This was him at, like, a really early green stage of his career, but he's massive, he's big, and most of the time he's on the show, he mows people down and murders them, and not just scrubs. He beats the hell out of guys like Randy Savage and Sting, and even Hogan sometimes. And actually, the worst booking for the Giant comes when he's dealing with Hogan, because Hogan always has to protect himself, and that's how you get stupid endings like the one that happened at Halloween Havoc 95. But when the Giant, like, is allowed to go and just be a big guy and toss people around, I think he's great. And it's one of those things that at the time, again, at the the internet people at the time hated big guys. They shat on big guys constantly, so the Giant at that point kind of got a bad rep. When I first got on the internet in, like, 96, 97, the Giant was, like, one of those, like, public enemy number one. Well, Hogan was public enemy number one on the net, but the Giant was one that got shit on a lot. And I'm watching these early episodes, I'm like, he is booked exactly how a big guy should be booked. He throws people around, doesn't sell a whole lot, doesn't get slammed much at all, and he wins most of the time. And he demolishes people. He'll kill people in, like, under a minute, and God, Hacksaw Jim Duggan got mowed down a lot. Even Ric Flair. Like, when he beat Ric Flair for the title, it was almost a squash match. Like, he almost completely dominated Flair, and he beat him for the title on Monday Nitro, which is a big deal. So I think the Giant is somebody that was promoted and presented really, really well, despite being stuck in a stupid stable at a stupid angle and had some horrible circumstances thrown his way, like the debut of the Yeti and being put in a monster truck fight with Hulk Hogan. That stuff, bag of shit. But the actual presentation of a big man, I thought, was done really, really well. And it's unfortunate that he never really he had a hard time maintaining that once the NWO came in, because ultimately he joined the NWO, and then that started the whole cycle of face turn, heel turn, face turn, heel turn, that basically embodied poor Paul White's entire career, where they could just never stay consistent with the guy. But in these early Nitros, he was one that really stood out to me. I'm like, I love watching this guy. He's great. And even the whole bit of him being Andre the Giant's son, some people kind of make fun of that. I'm like, I kind of like it. It's one of those crazy things. It's like Kane being the Undertaker's brother. It's like, yeah, okay, we know it's not real, but it's kind of awesome, and it references history, and like in Kane's case, it gave Undertaker a backstory that we never knew about, and in the Giants case, it like references the history of WrestleMania 3, and it's like this, the son coming back to avenge his father. I'm like, that's a great story. I think, it worked for me. So the Giant was one that really stood out to me in these early episodes, and I think as we got closer to the debut of the NWO, again, my cutoff point here is when Scott Hall showed up on the May 27th episode. May 27, 1996, I should say. Leading up to that, it got better and better and better. Hogan, I believe he was off to film a movie, so he was off TV at that point. And it was more focused on Randy Savage and the Four Horsemen and those guys. And you started to see some more of the Cruiserweights show up, and you started to see certain characters start to click, and they were doing the angle with the football players, like the Four Horsemen going up against Kevin Green and Mongo McMichael, and some of that was actually really fun. I actually really liked that match they did at that pay-per-view. I thought it was a really damn fun match. One of the better like wrestler versus non-wrestler matches of all time, I would say. But it's they were taking baby steps, and I think that was what Rome wasn't built in a day, and it wasn't it wasn't necessarily an overnight success, at least not from a creative standpoint. But I think the first episode hit it out of the park, especially with the debut of Lex Luger, right from under the WWE's noses. And I think that kind of set the tone, and then you had little moments like Medusa throwing the belt in the trash and various things like that helped set the tone for what the war was going to look like once WCW really kicked into high gear. And again, it started with the NWO, but I think what you see in this early period from September 95 to May 96, a lot of the baby steps towards moving past the things that were kind of weighing WCW down and kind of getting themselves in position to be the number one watched wrestling show on TV for 83 weeks. So, actually, even though there's no NWO and it's only 1 hour and a lot of the epic Nitro moments aren't featured in that early period, I did have a lot of fun going back and watching it. Again, not saying all of it was great, but there was plenty to enjoy, and it was fun to kind of watch the puzzle pieces kind of fall into place for what would ultimately come. So, this period, it's a very interesting one. Like I said, there's a lot of bad, but there's a lot of interesting as well, and there was enough to keep me kind of and I was trying to put myself in the mindset as if I was watching this for the first time, and there was stuff that I was worried that I would hate some of the early stuff, and it would make me kind of like not want to keep watching, even though I knew the NWO was coming. There was enough to kind of keep hooking me. It's like, okay, let's kind of see more of this. Let's see if we see Eddie Guerrero next week and see what he does, and even some guys like Craig Pitbull Pittman. I'm like, who the hell remembers him? Or Ice Train, or the American Males, like, who are not like the most celebrated guys, but there was this fun aspect of like, okay, who's gonna pop up this week? Like, who am I gonna pop for now? And because they didn't always have the same exact people every single week, so that's also fun as well. And that was part of WCW, just having a massive roster that was too big, but also allowed them to, kind of have fresher matchups week to week rather than just doing a bunch of rematches. So, I would recommend going back and checking out some of these early episodes. Again, some of it's terrible, but there's some interesting stuff there. And like I said, it's all about like putting the puzzle pieces into place. And that was kind of the fun part for me, was observing all of that. So, I think I've said enough about this period for Monday Nitro, and with each part of this Nitro retrospective, what I want to do is, instead of doing like a top 10 matches by the end or anything like that, because that would force me to keep track through the whole thing, and I don't want to do that, but because I'm a lazy son of a bitch, what I'm going to do is I'm going to name a best match, a best episode, and an MVP for each time period that I cover in the retrospective. So, MVP from September 95 to May 20th, 1996. Who am I going to give that to? I got to be honest, I was very tempted to give it to the Giant, because I really enjoyed watching a big guy mow down everybody. But I'm going to give it to Ric Flair, who I think had some of the best matches during the period. His bouts with Savage, his his tag matches and various things with Hogan. His even he had a match with Eddie Guerrero that was pretty good, and he put over the Giant in a championship match. And Ric Flair was like the main villain for most of this period, and was very entertaining. Like every time Flair had the mic, it was just like, oh, let's hear Rick. Let's hear what Rick has to say. He's gonna say something crazy. Let's hear it. And Ric Flair again with Woman and Miss Elizabeth at his side, that made him even more fun because it's almost like he could have fun just like macking on the two women, and it's like, oh my god, this is this is classic Rick, classic Rick. So Ric Flair was my favorite wrestler to watch during this period, with the Giant as kind of a runner-up. Best match, I'm going to give to Randy Savage versus Ric Flair for the world title from the January 22nd episode. These two typically worked pretty well together. They had some very good matches in WCW. They had one of my favorite Mania matches of all time at WrestleMania 8. And this was another stellar match between the two. One of their better ones, I would say. Very good stuff. And hey, it's two legends going at it with a world title on the line. I highly recommend checking it out. But my favorite episode is going to go to the April 29th, 1996 episode. Top to bottom, it was just one of the most entertaining episodes. Well, for me, it's the most entertaining episode during this period. Just a great action all the way through. You had a tag team title match, Lex Luger and Sting versus Harlem Heat. I don't think I can get any more WCW than that, and I mean that as a positive. Such a cool match, and I really enjoyed watching it. Another super cool match, I would say match of the night from the show, was a parking lot brawl between Lord Steven Regal and the Belfast Brawler, better known as Fit Finlay. So this is them at like an earlier stage of their career than what we would know them as in the WWE. And this was, you think of these guys as being two technicians and great in-ring workers, and then you watch this thing, and it is a fucking brawl. Like, to me, this match is one of the ones that kind of set the tone for the hardcore matches that we would see during the Monday Night Wars period. I think the Piper Goldust Hollywood Backlot Brawl was a big component of that. The Undertaker Mankind Boiler Room Brawl was a big match that helped shape that. But this match right here, I mean, this thing looked like a fucking fight. It was one of the coolest matches. If you're not going to have it in the ring and just have a fucking fight, like, it was, I thought that was really cool and really well done. And from two guys that you typically expect to be more technical, they go out there and just beat the ever-living crap out of each other. It was awesome. And then in the main event, we had the Giant defeating Ric Flair to become the World Heavyweight Champion. So it was the battle of my two MVPs. Go figure. So yeah, I'm going to give best episode to April 29th, 1996. So that concludes part one of my Nitro Retrospective. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. I had fun talking about it. I'm going to have fun watching more Nitro. I think it's going to be a blast. Especially now that I'm through 96. It's like, okay, now we're going to get into the full swing of like the Hogan Sting build-up, and watching all of that is going to be great. When I do part two, I'm going to be nerding out over the NWO so much it'll be crazy. So I'm going to have lots of fun with this. But that is all I have for you now. Thank you everyone for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, post your comments down below, and hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post new videos. And follow me on Twitter. The link is in the description. But take care, good night, and have a good weekend.